Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Hangouts and Headlines here on May 10th, 2024. I'm excited to hang out with all of you today. We've got a fun conversation here on Fun Day Friday when we used to talk about things like movies and video games and television and Hangouts and Headlines. So I'm bringing that back a little bit. And I'm very happy to be here to discuss video games and movies and media with you today. So if you are in the chat, say hi. Tell me where you're chatting in from, how you're doing today, what else might be going on. We're in the Hangouts portion of the show. This is where we all can chat about whatever it is that we like before we get into the headlines and talking about the media and coverage of things. So please do pop in. Let me know how you're doing, and I will try to elevate some of this to the video so that I can talk to you a little bit more directly without looking like I'm talking to myself. So here's new tricks. Really enjoying this. Still watch the old ones. I'm glad that you're already really enjoying this. Less than 2 minutes into the broadcast, new tricks. That's really all I can hope to bring to the table. So thank you for joining us today. And I'm very glad that you're still watching the old ones. I like to think that they are seasoned or vintage rather than old, but that's all fair. Tracy G says, good morning and happy Friday. Fridays are the best, right? Maybe Saturdays are the best, but Fridays are still pretty good. And I'm very glad to be here talking about these things on a Friday with you all. Minoto says, hi, Rick. Hi, Mrs. Hoeg. Is Mrs. Hoeg in the chat? Oh, she is. Yes. Thanks for joining, everyone, says Mrs. Hoeglaw. Thank you, Minoto, for joining. And thank you, lovely wife, for being here as well. Kelly says she's drinking tea in Southeast London. It's a very fancy Friday for Kelly. I hope you are doing well. And I can't believe that you are in Southeast London listening to me on YouTube, but I really appreciate it. Tracy G says, no way, Fridays are the best. I do love Fridays. Saturdays I like because you don't have the same kind of client pull or email buzzing that I have during the work week, but I can understand Fridays being argued as the best. Katie says, hey ho, glad to see you. I'm playing hooky from the Karen Reed trial. I do know that a lot of my colleagues on YouTube are covering the Karen Reed trial. We heard that in the stream about the Stroke Awards last week. We saw that Emily D. Baker is covering it. Ian is covering it in recap form. Alita at Legal Bites is covering it. I don't know whether Rob is covering it, but he does his Friday night show, so he probably is touching on it at least. But yeah, I was under the impression Fridays were going to be off for that trial, but I guess that's not the case. So thank you for playing hooky with me. Sardism says they're in Ohio checking in with origami and mobile games. I think that is the right angle of attack for this particular topic today. We're going to be talking about games. We're going to be talking about coverage of games and media companies and how they deal with it, including media companies that want to break into mobile. So enjoy your origami, enjoy your mobile game Sardinisms, and thank you for being here. Caubert says, greetings from Estonia. Nice to catch your live stream, Estonia. Well, thank you for joining us from so far away. I'm always very appreciative to hear about folks joining us here on YouTube and Hangouts and Headlines from all over the globe. Special Salt says, first time I've gotten to watch the stream live. Hi from Australia, Hoeg. Yeah, that's because it's the middle of the night in Australia, right? Am I right on that? So thank you for joining us live. I'm very happy to have you here. I really appreciate it. Ray XYZ says, here from Brazil, playing Agarest War for the third time to finally get that 100%. I have not played that in years. So congratulations on trying to complete everything in any given video game, which I can almost never do. So thank you for having me on next to you while you try to complete that 100%. La Heathers says they can't get the Australia or Estonia credit. I'm not far, just a state below, but that could be Indiana or Ohio. So that's a mystery that we'll have to solve later on in the broadcast, La Heathers. I hope you're doing well today. Special Salt says, yes, it is in fact the middle of the night, 12:09 a.m. on the east coast of Australia. So thank you for joining us on the middle of the night. The midnight hour. I should put on my late night radio voice. Thank you for joining us. And we'll try to hit you with all of those witching hour favorites. All right, everybody. Well, I think we've basically covered everyone that wanted to get in on talking about where they're calling in from. Have you guys seen anything good lately on TV or movies or video games that might come up as part of this conversation? I'm always interested in finding new and better things to watch or to play. So I've got some that I'm going to talk about in the Bitcast on Sunday, So if you don't know, I do talk about video games with 3 other co-hosts on the Bitcast, on Season Gaming, and on this channel at 11 a.m. Eastern every Sunday. And one of the topics that we discuss are the really random games that I'm playing. I am, in fact, playing a few random games this week. But those are really going to be more topics of discussion later on in this video than right now. So I want to save that for just a minute. Sardism says they've been binging Unicorn Overlord, which is a very good video game that I've enjoyed a lot this week, or enjoyed a lot this year, and reading a ton of books. I think that's fantastic. Kelly's been watching David at Prototopics playing Stellar Blade. I've also been enjoying Stellar Blade. I didn't know David was doing a run through, but I'm glad you're getting a chance to watch. Mrs. Hoeglaw says, hello, Europe friends. And indeed, hello, Europe friends. And also calls out Against the Tide, who is here modding for the channel. And if you didn't see, if you're not on Twitter, I can't blame you. It's a real negative space. Doesn't always make me happy. So if you aren't on Twitter, you may not have seen that Against the Tide put out a image of me as the Joker for this week's episode of Hangouts and Headlines. So we'll see if I can pull that up here behind the scenes, because I accidentally deleted it. But if I can't, you can just imagine me looking like the Joker. There. Is everybody horrified? Good. Okay, now let's take a look at what Against the Tide was able to put together with me as the Joker. I've really never actually thought about myself in this role, but it is quite a frightening sight, isn't it? And certainly that green hair isn't doing me a lot of favors, but I do like the leather jacket. So maybe I'll move into wearing purple shirts and leather jackets, and that'll really make Mrs. Hoeglaw very excited. Okay, so thank you, Against the Tide, for all of this. Against the Tide is on Twitter all the time, telling folks about the shows that we do on this channel. Does a fantastic job, and also creates artwork that puts me in various different lights, including as the Joker, and then shows me some of the rejects of me as the Joker a little bit lower. So all of this is available for you on Twitter, but for now, I'm going to hide the horrific images from my wife because she would rather they not be on screen. So with that said, thank you, everyone, for checking those out. Kurt of Uncivil Law, thank you for being here in the chat. How did you get those scars, Hoeg, from the image of me as the Joker? I don't know. The scars I have on my own head are from brain surgery, but I don't know how I got the scars that the AI put on me in my Joker image. Mrs. Hoeglaw says that's horrifying. Yeah, I knew you would be a big fan of that image, but that's okay. That is pretty creepy, says Kelly. Well, yeah, it is creepy. But the Joker is a creepy character. I think if you're going to play the Joker, you want to be seen as creepy, yes? So I think the job was done in that particular image. But that said, all right. Tracy G says the art portion of the Bitcast has become one of my favorite segments. That's right. So Against the Tide also helps with the Bitcast and coverage on this channel of the Bitcast simultaneously being streamed, and does imagery for all of us that are hosting the Bitcast. So if you like that Joker image, you can see all sorts of horrifying images of the various hosts of the Bitcast on Sundays. And Against the Tide, thank you again for doing all of that for me and for us. So thank you. It says, yes, the brain surgery. I'm not sure that actually justifies the Joker's scars in that image, but hey, is what it is. All right. So with that said, let's get into more of the headlines portion of our discussions here. And this will be a relatively chill conversation, I think. As always, I try not to bring in super serious articles in a Friday Fun Day setting. So this is about video games. This is about a specific video game called Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, in which you play as the Suicide Squad and are trying to kill Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and Green Lantern and the Flash in order to save them, because they've been taken over by mind control from Brainiac, who's a DC villain. And this game was made by a company called Rocksteady, which made a series of Batman games before the Suicide Squad called the Arkham Universe, with the first being Batman Arkham Asylum, the second being Batman Arkham City, and the last being Batman Arkham Knight. And those games are a little bit older now, and it took them a while to get this Suicide Squad game done. But at the end of the day, it didn't really take off like they had hoped. And so various people have made various opinion pieces on what that means, how that might affect the video game industry, what it might say about the video game industry. And some, I think, have gone a little bit too far with that analysis. And that's what I want to talk about today is kind of the notion of reading things not just for what they say in the editorializing that they might make in the headlines and in between the lines of what they write, but also what they aren't saying and how narratives can essentially lead authors, including writers, including me, including every human being, down certain avenues of thought that maybe aren't justified by the evidence before them. So, with that as our background, we're going to look at the headline from Business Insider: Why a failed video game cost Warner Brothers 200 million US dollars. And this is written by Peter Kafka, and I highlighted that just because I found it interesting. This is a bit of a Kafka-esque kind of lark into the logic of video game finances, if you're familiar with that term. It is a reference to Franz Kafka and talks of the things like the trial and the metamorphosis of having a nightmarishly complex, bizarre, or illogical quality, which I would like to offer is how I think about accounting and generally accepted accounting principles in a lot of ways. Very Byzantine, very illogical, very frustrating. And it's a little bit ironic that this is written by a Peter Kafka as their chief correspondent covering media and technology. But the reason I say that is because Warner Brothers is kind of a weird thing to report on as it is. And there's a lot more going on here than this article suggests. So let's take a look at what his bullet points, his key points that he wants you to take away from this article is. Warner Brothers Discovery reported a $200 million loss on the game Suicide Squad Killed the Justice League. And yes, this is all kind of coming out of the fact that Warner Brothers Discovery just put out its financial reports for the last quarter. It's a reminder of how similar the video game business is to Hollywood. Big expenses, big rewards, big penalties for missing. Big media companies can't ignore video games, but should they be making their own? So you can kind of see just in these key points that outside of the question of why a failed video game cost Warner Brothers $200 million, which would be a fairly simple analysis of how much they paid in salaries, how much they paid in licenses, how much money they did or didn't make in selling the product that they finally developed. Instead, we get a kind of thesis here of Warner Brothers lost a lot of money. Movie studios lose a lot of money on making movies. So big media companies are a little bit like movie companies, but should they be involved in making video games on the whole? Which is a lot to put on a single video game that is about 3 months old, and which I will tell you I have enjoyed myself. So when we get to the first bit of this article, did you play Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, the video game that came out in February? Me neither, he answers himself. But unfortunately for this particular reader, I did in fact play Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. A number of people did, but not enough for Warner Brothers Discovery. And he says it's very few people did, and the ones who did really didn't like it. And this is kind of a discussion point that we would have with all kind of critical conversation, which is to say this link that he has here is to the Metacritic score for the game. And let me see if I can pull up the right tab here. And that Metacritic score is fairly low. But as you may have heard us discuss on that Bitcast that we've talked about already in this video, I and Ains here, the main host of the Bitcast, are folks that have enjoyed certain aspects of the Suicide Squad. And you can see here, this is the Xbox Series X reviews for Suicide Squad, averaging a 61. That's not great. If we look at PlayStation 5, it's going to be averaging a 60. It's no better. But there are reviews here that liked it just fine. You've got Gamers Heroes VGC giving it various scores in the 8s range. And then you've got places like IGN that are going to rate it a lot lower towards the end here. And so there is a mixed bag of reviews of this game. I would say, as I said on the Bitcast, that this is a game that has a lot of good ideas with how combat works and how the actual 30 seconds of fun loop plays. But it doesn't meet the goals of telling a narrative or having an interesting plot like the earlier Batman games, or like what I think people were looking for from this game, perhaps unfairly. But it's no doubt that it wasn't reviewed very well. But the first thing I would raise here is that in general, critical acclaim is not the be all and end all of when a piece of media is successful, right? We know this intuitively from movies. And that's why it comes up here when he's comparing video games to movies. Yes, they took a big swing. Yes, it didn't succeed. It doesn't appear. But there are a lot of movies that don't reach critical acclaim that make tons of money from consumers. That there is a difference between critics liking something and people liking something, which has only become kind of more acknowledged as we proceed into the 2020s here. But if you think of a movie like the Transformers series that all the critics hated and that were the highest revenue generating movies of the summers that they released in, it isn't a strong argument to my eye to say those that played the game really didn't like it, when what you're talking about are folks that are reviewing things for outlets, whether it be IGN or VGC or some of the other ones that we saw in that Metacritic score. Critics aren't the ones that decide whether a game succeeds or not. And I know that would make my friend Travis on the Bitcast unhappy, I think, to some extent. But critics and critique are important for media. It's important to understand why something works or why it doesn't, and to help guide the people that make those particular pieces of media in the efforts to reach the biggest audiences and have the most successful pieces of media. But it doesn't make it the end all be all, right? Critics have a certain amount of separation from mass media consumption based on their jobs as it stands, right? When you watch 200 movies a year, it's different from the guy that watches 6. But it's not the end of the story here. Suicide Squad must have something else going on with it rather than just the critical reviews, because there are a lot of games that get 6s and 7s that are perfectly successful and don't have a $200 million loss on the books. Which leads us to the next point here, which I think is a little bit elided in this conversation. This led the company to take a staggering $200 million loss on the game, which it just closed in its first quarter earnings on Thursday. Doesn't really come from the reviews or the fact that this author didn't play it. It comes from something else, and it seems remiss to not mention in this article that Warner Brothers Discovery, having recently been purchased in the merger with Discovery and looking at a different way of analyzing their books and records overall, has been very, very aggressive in trying to put big losses on their books in order to get tax breaks and other benefits from their financial statements, right? So we saw earlier this year, or I guess at the end of last year, the years blend together. Coyote versus Acme was a Warner Brothers movie that was finished, that was shelved by Warner Brothers Discovery in order to get a $30 million tax write-off. So it seems like Warner Brothers is perhaps the wrong way to have this thesis that we're talking about, that movies and video games are similar, and we're not sure if big media companies can make video games, when Warner Brothers is aggressively doing things with its financials in order to get certain benefits. And if Suicide Squad is truly this big a failure, it's a little bit hard to tell just from looking at the Warner Brothers financial statements that otherwise have a lot of aggression in them. Warner Brothers Discovery's chief financial officer, Gunnar Weidenfels, described the game's results as disappointing, undoubtedly so, and the company repeatedly pointed out the impact of the game's failure on its bottom line, particularly since a year ago it had a massive hit with a different game, Hogwarts Legacy. We'll talk more about that in just a minute, because I do think this article has another spot where it kind of misses on what it should be talking about. Hogwarts Legacy was the highest selling video game of 2023, even more than the entry of Call of Duty that year, which is a first for a long, long time. A lot of people really enjoyed that game. It was not particularly highly reviewed, though it did review better than Suicide Squad. It was just a match of intellectual property with what players and gamers wanted out of a game experiencing that intellectual property. Namely, it was an open world at Hogwarts with a single player focus that let you live the fantasy of being a wizard or witch at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. So that was an exact match for the market, and sometimes executives get it right, just as they sometimes get it wrong. By comparison, Suicide Squad is best thought of as a live service game that was focused on a multiplayer element rather than a storytelling, and chasing after some of the money that you might have seen in games like Fortnite or Apex Legends or even Call of Duty, which is not quite a live service game as we think about it. But this is one of those areas where Warner Brothers was chasing after a certain audience and a certain amount of money with a single player company and didn't succeed to where they wanted to be. Whether or not you think they actually lost $200 million, whether or not you think Warner Brothers is being aggressive, whether or not you think this author is correct in his hypothesis, there is no question that all of the noise coming out from Warner Brothers is that the sales were disappointing. They aren't happy with how that game was received by the market. But sometimes, and I know this is going to hurt the executives that are watching this, sometimes executives get it wrong, right? Executives, no matter how much they're paid, are still human beings. They make mistakes, and we see all the time media companies and other companies chase after a trend, and be a little bit late to the party, right? So Suicide Squad is a live service game that has a lot of elements that work pretty well and a lot that don't. And that isn't enough to kind of penetrate the live service market, where you can really only sustain a few games because they take so much time to play and to experience. And that they've been worked on for years and years and years with more content than Suicide Squad can put forth. So it appears to me that Warner Brothers is late to the party with Suicide Squad. And though I have enjoyed some of my play sessions with it, it wasn't a game that was going to make Fortnite money, even if that's what they were chasing, versus Hogwarts Legacy, which is a different kind of game that is exactly a match for both what critics like, single player story narratives, and what players like, which is open world fantasy fulfillment in intellectual property that they haven't gotten to experience before, right? If you're a fan of Hogwarts, if you're a fan of Harry Potter, one of the things that you probably have thought about is what it would be like to attend Hogwarts yourself. And so a game that can realize that fantasy is likely to do much better. But that's pretty easy for me to say after the fact. I'm not the one signing checks or deciding what the projects are going to be 10 years ago in order to figure out what is going to make money in 2023 and 2024. All of which points out something the games industry has been grappling with for some time, says this author. It looks more and more like Hollywood. That means it places very big bets on would-be blockbusters, which are increasingly tied to intellectual property that's been successful in the past. When that strategy works, it's great. And when it doesn't, and this links to another kind of complaint article, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But here, I think there's some correctness here and some incorrectness here, which is always kind of the most dangerous place in an article. I think it's correct that video games have long been kind of moving towards a studio structure and a Hollywood structure that to me mirrors some of the movement that you saw in kind of the old days of Hollywood, the 20s and the 30s, moving into the 40s, rather than looking at it right now with would-be blockbusters and whatnot. But certainly it is the case that video games cost more money to make now than they did in the 80s. And part of that is going to be reflective of a lower risk tolerance and a move towards having would-be blockbusters, right? In general, if you're going to spend a lot of money on something, you'd like it to make a lot of money back rather than making kind of singles and doubles rather than home runs. That being said, I don't think this is actually a very apt description of the video game industry as it stands in 2024 and takes a myopic look at what video games mean today, right? So if we think about it ourselves, we look at this and say, okay, that might be right for Xbox, that might be right for PlayStation, that might be right for the big console sellers, but there seems to have been a lot of successes this year that don't fit that bill, that the video game industry is supporting things that aren't would-be blockbusters. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at something like the Steam top sellers this week, we see at the top of the list a game called Animal Well. And you can see pictures of it on your right side here. Suffice it to say, Animal Well is not a Transformers summer blockbuster type movie. It is a video game made by, my understanding is one person, published by a company that was started by a YouTuber, and is a wildly successful, critically acclaimed game right now. And maybe you think that that is an exception. Undoubtedly it is. But if we look at this whole list, Helldivers 2, sure, is a big 3D game made by Sony or made by a Sony company. The next one is Hades 2, which is a big name and a very critically acclaimed series, but from a very small company that focuses on narrative and storytelling more than anything else. So they use their smallness and their ability to make only a certain amount of resources to make successful games on an economic basis. And yes, that works for them. It could work for bigger companies too. We continue down. We got Counter-Strike 2, which is a Valve standby. V Rising is another indie type game that you'll see on PlayStation later this year. Little Kitty Big City, which is going to go in the Hoeg's notes for the Bitcast, so you guys have a spoiler alert for Sunday. Little Kitty Big City is an indie game in which you play a cartoon cat trying to get back up to your perch in a Tokyo-like city. It is fantastic. My daughter loves it. I've enjoyed playing it with her. But a big blockbuster game, it is not. And on top of those games, this whole year has been an exploration in people looking for other games to play, right? You may have heard us talk about Balatro. Obviously not a graphical showpiece, but this is a game in which you create poker hands and get various jokers, much like myself, to play that change the rules of how your poker hands are scored, and you try to beat more and higher antes as you progress through the game, right? It is not a looker. It is just a fantastic game that is addictive to play and is a wonderful experience that I've enjoyed very much this year. Similarly, you might have heard of Pal World, probably because we covered it on this channel when it was accused of copyright infringement from various quarters because it was so successful. Right here, you see a headline: 1.3 billion hours in the game. And when my friend Travis at Bitcast was set, he was going to review Pal World for IGN. It was not at the time of his assignment something that was going to be this huge multi-review process for the company. It was not something that they were super enthused about. But like Balatro, like Manor Lords, which is one I wanted to bring up here, there are a number of successful games in the video game industry right now. They just don't look like what Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is sold as. So this is a conversation to be had across the video game industry. And certainly there are bad news items that we'll also talk about towards the end of this video. But to suggest that it is entirely Hollywood is to look too closely at just one specific corner of video games, and that's console creation. That's these console manufacturers and their first party output, and the big publishers like Electronic Arts and Ubisoft. Obviously, the video game industry is having a certain amount of difficulty right now based on contractions within the console sales market and sales through of things like Game Pass and subscription services on a video game level. That is not unique to video games. Subscription services across the board are trying to figure out what the future looks like. Some are adding ads in order to make revenue up. Some are doing other things like bundling themselves with other streaming services in order to make a kind of quasi-streaming cable outlet in order to make money for themselves. It is not unique to video games, and yet we continue here with a more analysis of Suicide Squad. Even by those standards, Suicide Squad is a spectacular dud, says the author, in line with some of the worst mistakes a movie studio has ever made. In 2012, for instance, Disney announced it would take a $200 million charge for John Carter. A year later, it said it would lose up to $190 million on The Lone Ranger. Now, here we get a little bit stranger, right? Because if you've ever heard of the term Hollywood math, you know already that these studios are in the business of making sure that their movies look like they don't make money for tax and other reasons. And so you've seen lawsuits covered on this channel and others on YouTube or just in the media in general of folks that are suing places like New Line Cinema for saying things like The Lord of the Rings never made any money. And that ultimately got settled, but you know that this math is always aggressive on these kinds of things. And so Disney announced it takes a $200 million charge on John Carter and then more on Lone Ranger is known as Disney trying to keep money off the books. And John Carter was a critical, I'm going to say success. It is not critically abysmal, and is in fact a movie that I enjoy. While The Lone Ranger was them following Gore Verbinski with more money after his success in Pirates of the Caribbean. So sometimes as a movie studio, you make movies with people that you like to work with because they've made you money on something else, and this is what they want to make. And that is all kind of a part of the package of making all the oodles of money that you made with a franchise like Pirates of the Caribbean. That all said, Suicide Squad is not kind of analogous to these types of one-off movies because Suicide Squad is all of 3 months old, and as a live service output was designed to try to get more money and sell battle passes and things going into the future. Now, will that succeed? Warner Brothers would suggest that it's not looking like it. It doesn't have the runway to succeed with what sales they've made so far. But live service games, unlike a movie like John Carter, which is just put out there and you never hear about it again, is the type of product that will evolve, will change, and can still succeed after it was originally launched. Fortnite, despite all of its success, was not launched as a battle royale game. It was launched as a game in which you made forts and fought off zombies, which is now called Save the World as a mode. But people really didn't grab on to Save the World. And in fact, a game called PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds was having huge success when Fortnite was first introduced to the world. And so they took that success and said, we can do that within our game. And they made Battle Royale, and Fortnite, as you know it, came to be, which isn't to take away from them. It just means that live service games can pivot perhaps more than something that is as in concrete as a finished movie or television product. All of which might make you question yet again if a big media company ought to be in games at all. I do not question it. They should. Should they make them themselves? That's an open question. Big media doesn't have an answer to that question, by the way. Sometimes companies like Disney make really big investments in games, correctly assessing that the people who watch their TV shows and movies also spend a lot of time playing games. Sometimes they pivot out of that strategy after concluding that making good TV shows and movies doesn't give them a leg up when it comes to making games. Which is all kind of mealy mouth and kind of hand waving and saying sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But here, when you're writing this story and you've put out there that Warner Brothers is disappointed with Suicide Squad because they were really happy with Hogwarts Legacy last year, and you want to tie that into Disney and whether Disney was making video games, it's probably a good idea to mention that Avalanche Software, the developers and creators of Hogwarts Legacy for Warner Brothers, used to be a Walt Disney company, right? Well, here we have the Wikipedia entry. The studio was acquired by the games arm of the Walt Disney Company in May 2005 and spent the next 10 years developing Disney-related titles, including the Toys to Life game Disney Infinity. In May 2016, due to a declining Toys to Life games market, Disney decided to close the games arm, including Avalanche. Warner Brother Games acquired the studio and reopened it in January 2017, and then it would later release Hogwarts Legacy in 2023. And as I just mentioned, it made a lot of money doing so. So it seems to me like if you're going to put all these things together, one thing that you should be discussing is that there is a common element. It is the developer of the game. Disney had some success with Disney Infinity and then decided to get out because they are kind of moving always between whether they want to make video games or not. Right now, their strategy is to license out their intellectual property so that folks can make games like Disney Dreamlight Valley or Speedstorm, and that is proving to be successful for them. You have EA making games like Jedi Survivor and Jedi Fallen Order and things like that. But before, they had an in-house developer in Avalanche. Warner Brothers bought that in-house developer and then immediately had success with that developer with Hogwarts Legacy. Rocksteady, by comparison, didn't have a level of success with existing intellectual property on a live services basis. And so moving forward with Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League in the way that they did was always going to be a different kind of risk than making a game like Hogwarts Legacy, where you have to spend a lot of money, but you know exactly what the product is when it goes to market. Warner Brothers Discovery has gone through that indecision in the past, says our author. Its previous owners thought that they might sell the company's game business, then decided to keep it. Now, there were rumors that they were potentially going to shop it at the time. Obviously, getting sold and being owned by a different group changes your hypothesis there because there's different people thinking about it. You can see it at other big media companies, like at Disney, which has made multiple forays into games and pulled back, and most recently announced a $1.5 billion investment in Epic Games, the company behind Fortnite. And Netflix started building its own games division a few years ago, though the results seem underwhelming so far, and the company has been rethinking its strategy as well. Yes, Netflix has been moving slowly, right? They've been moving into mobile games and smaller games and doing the exact opposite of what this article suggests is the future for video gaming. So it doesn't match up with his hypothesis, doesn't match up with his articles, so he has to put it as a sentence right at the end, which isn't to deride this reporting or this headline, except to note that it is incomplete. Right? The Suicide Squad is an odd choice here because it is a live service game that is operating in a different market than things like Hogwarts Legacy. Warner Brothers is an odd choice because they are very aggressive in their financials and like to book huge losses on things for tax benefits in a way that maybe other studios wouldn't do it. It's odd to talk about Disney as a comparison to Warner Brothers and Hogwarts and things like that because Disney has that direct line of connection. And then on top of all that, you also have a gaming industry that is dealing with certain political and other issues that also hit Suicide Squad right where it lives, right? You might have seen a video here on this channel called Detecting a Bunch of Babies, Sweet Baby Inc. times Harassment. Sweet Baby Inc. being the narrative consulting firm that worked on games like Spider-Man 2 and Alan Wake 2 and got a lot of heat from corners of the internet for making games they didn't like, including Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. So there was a movement against Suicide Squad at the same time as all of these discussions that we are having. And while you can see in that video, I'm unwilling to say that Sweet Baby Inc. is really moving the needle on any specific game. I really disliked Spider-Man 2. I really liked Alan Wake 2. That its impact by folks noticing when it is involved in a game could impact something like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Now, that all said, I also want to point out that this is not the only place that this is reported. We've got the Hollywood Reporter article here, and I wanted to reference that they did have a quote that says, "What happened in the 2010s is the industry went down a very dangerous financial path of trying to invest in every type of content, in every genre to try to be something for everyone, talking about their streaming service, and they're going to try to pull back and bundle it, as I said, as a kind of answer to that." And then also noticed that they had a weaker performance in video gaming. In the first quarter of 2023, the video game Hogwarts Legacy did very well. making for a tough comparison to the first quarter of this year. They didn't have a Hogwarts Legacy to release this first quarter. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League didn't do well, hitting gaming revenue and earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, or EBITDA, to those of you that just really like accounting terms. And so Hollywood Reporter is reporting on this with a little bit less editorializing than the Business Insider article, but this is a news item, right? I don't want to suggest that this isn't something that should be discussed, but whenever you see a news item like this, I would recommend thinking about what is factoring into why this is being reported in this specific way, how the editorializing is happening, and why this might be happening. And in this case, I think we have an answer, which is to say this same author a few months ago had an article entitled, "The Video Game Industry is in Trouble. Here's Why." And with that as your kind of background for what's happening, including the bullet point, big budget titles dominate and it's hard for new games to break through, just like in Hollywood, you're going to get something that essentially informs your take on news like what we saw with Suicide Squad and Warner Brothers. So for this particular author, it's a kind of corollary to when all you have is a hammer, everything you see is a nail, right? When you have this already as your hypothesis, when this is your working assumption from 3 months ago, and you get something like the Suicide Squad news, you kind of comport all of the various aspects of it to justifying what you suggested was already the way it was going. And we're all guilty of this, right? Human beings want to be right on stuff like this. And so we take what news is being presented to us and say, oh, yes, that obviously fits our thesis from earlier. But I want to point out that that happens to everybody. And we can use our critical reading skills when we're looking at an article to analyze this and say, well, okay, but it's a live service game from a single player company against a single player game that worked out well last year. It's really not indicative of anything in particular. It's also being fought by things like the Sweet Baby ink detection side of the conversation. And it's clear that your comparison to Hollywood is a little bit stretched because you're not even understanding the comparisons and threads that go from Avalanche Software, from Disney through Warner Brothers, and why that's a part of the story as well. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today on the Hangouts or on the headline side of the thing. But let me know whether you have any other thoughts on either Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, and if you do, that's fantastic. Warner Brothers Discovery, HBO Max, the bundling that's coming with Disney Plus and HBO and those kinds of things. Do let me know, because I would love to talk about all of it with you. And maybe you think I was too harsh on this particular author. I don't mean to be, but I'm happy to have that comment as well. But Bad as a Hog has a thought here, says, I think the game failed because it was in development so long, almost 10 years. I think that they actually went through a couple of ideas for what they wanted to do as a live service entry, and this is what they wound up with. So it's probably less than 10 years, but it certainly took them a long time between products that went out the door. Newspin says, I don't think any anti-Sweet Baby movement affected the game at all. The game was already out of the conversation by the time the Sweet Baby stuff came around. I don't know. I think Sweet Baby stuff, if you had your ear to the ground on the video game industry, was really happening at the end of last year. I was hearing it about my kind words for Alan Wake 2 at the end of last year. So I don't know whether it affected anything in lights, right, in big media articles, but it might have affected things in the background. And I certainly think it popped up basically as soon as the game came out. I see Against the Tide is talking to Dan Rodriguez. Is Dan from the Bitcast here? I wish he was wrong, Tide. He's not, and it makes me sad. I don't know who he might be talking to. Maybe he's talking about me. But I appreciate it, Dan, for being here. We have talked about the Bitcast. If you like seeing Dan in chat, you haven't lived until you've seen him live and in color, which you can do on the Bitcast every Sunday. Come by. We have a great time. You don't have to love video games to enjoy seeing Tie Guy Travis here just yell at me and tell me I'm wrong about everything that I say. And here's Dan in the bottom right, who's a fantastic host as well. And Ains putting up with all three of us. So please do pop in. Thank you for being here in the chat, Dan. Bad as a Hog, right? But how was the $200 million loss calculated? And that's financial statements, right? And I'm the wrong guy to talk about financials with. I can speak to them as much as any lawyer because I've gone through them a lot in due diligence and looking at deals. But expertise there is really best left to the accountants and the financial experts. So how was it calculated? Probably with some Hollywood math, probably because they wanted it to be low because low income is good for taxes. But we can't say for sure. Chris Smith says, Kill the Justice League was begun like 4 years ago. Rocksteady was making it into a live service. I know that it was a long and tortuous path to get to this particular product from them. And certainly that's a part of the conversation as well. Greg says, Kill the Justice League failed because it was a boring, repetitive game with overpriced microtransactions. I don't think I've spent anything on microtransactions in that game. These companies need to look at Helldivers 2 as a masterclass in live service gaming. Well, I could have done a video on Helldivers 2 this week, and I might still next week, but certainly it was a masterclass in marketing and certain aspects of what that game can be. They obviously had a foot fault with Sony this week and had some difficulties with Steam reviews and whatnot. But certainly, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is better moment to moment than its overall macro game design is. Right. For the most part, the game is comprised of multiplayer type missions that can be added to in seasons and live service content, but don't actually present a unique experience while you're playing it the first time. And I think that's its biggest problem. It's not a Batman game. It's not an Arkham game. And while I think that any given conflict and a given combat encounter in that game is fun in the micro, on the macro, you're just doing the same thing over and over again. So I can certainly agree there. Chris Smith, Hogla, are you planning to play Hades 2 and Animal Well, the Donkey published game? I'm already playing Animal Well. I will say that the precision required in some of the jumping puzzles and things in Animal Well are maybe a little bit beyond me right now. Hades 2, I have really gifted to my daughter because she loves Hades 1 so much, so I'm not jumping into that individually myself, but we have purchased both of those products in the Hoeg house. And I love supporting indies whenever I can. I play all sorts of weird stuff. Dan May asks, has Sony refunded the Helldivers 2 game to players from the countries they just removed from Steam? My understanding of that, and again, I know probably as much as anybody looking at it from 30,000 feet on the outside, is that they removed it from sale in those countries, but did not otherwise take away access to people that already had it. So I believe that those players can still play, especially now that they've rescinded the PSN requirement to play Helldivers 2. But don't hold me to that because it would require a little bit more research to make sure on those points. But I believe that the players that already have it can still play it. They just can't buy it in those jurisdictions anymore. Newspin says Suicide Squad wanted the sales of the Arkham Harry Potter games and then the ongoing microtransactions after that. I think they thought their reputation would carry the day. I think their reputation did help them in some ways, but it hurt them in other ways, right? If you go in expecting an Arkham game, it's really disappointing. And certainly parts of Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League have a single player narrative element that really doesn't mesh very well with what the game actually is. So I think that it was a confused project on the whole, but I agree that they wanted a big intellectual property purchase on the live service side of things, and it just didn't work out for them. I actually think Suicide Squad as an IP is a bad push. I don't think it's a particularly beloved intellectual property, and I don't think that I enjoyed really either version of the Suicide Squad movies. So I wasn't super enthused about the game until really I saw some of the developer videos and they talked about what their design elements in the game were. So I am probably a unique case there, but I think that the game is better than some of the critics have given it credit for. Magnus Prime says, anyone else missed AA games? Not the big tent poles, but not indie either. There were a lot more of those back in the 90s and 2000s than there are now. Yes, I agree that the kind of mid-range game existed more prevalently in the PlayStation and PlayStation 2 eras than it does now, but they are still out there. I play a lot of weird games. One of the things I recommended last week on the Bitcast was a game called Saga Emerald Beyond, which is an RPG by Square. So it's not like nothing, but it is not a Final Fantasy. It's not that huge multi-$100 million budget. It is a little RPG with a fantastic battle system that reminds me of some of the AA games and some of the old school games of the day. So I recommend trying Saga Emerald Beyond. I recommend looking at the Steam lists for other things that might work for you. They don't have to be indies. They don't have to look like Animal Well. There's a lot of things that are kind of in the mid-range. On the Metroidvania side of things, you might have heard of Tales of Kinzera. Zao is kind of at that level. Prince of Persia, The Lost Crown is kind of at that level. But yes, I agree that there used to be more variety. And one of the things that I think that the industry is dealing with right now is figuring out whether subscriptions are sustainable, exactly what can sustain them if they are, and not getting caught in the Hollywood blockbuster mindset where you do only make MCU movies or you do only make Westerns in the 50s. And certainly when you have some of these bets turn out like this one for Warner Brothers, it is worth noting that these executives are going to have to re-examine their premises. But it doesn't mean that everything in gaming is devoted to blockbusters in the same way as movies, right? The movie analogy fails when you think about blockbusters still make the most money for movies, and yet they aren't the ones that are nominated for Oscars. They aren't the ones that are getting the 5-star reviews for the most part, right? And by comparison, the Oscar-nominated movies might get a certain bump for being nominated or even for winning an Oscar, but in general, they are at the bottom end of the revenue stream for movies. They're successful movies as art. They're successful for reasons that the Oscars wish to reward, but they aren't making Transformers money. They aren't making, in general, Avatar money, whatever other money you might be thinking of as the blockbuster of your choice. And so video games aren't there yet. Indies still make a lot of money, can make a lot of money, right? They're not all indies make a lot of money, but indies have the capability of busting out, like we saw with Pal World or Balatro or Manor Lords or a bunch of other things that are happening. Animal Well might wind up there after a week or a month of sales. We don't know. That's still too new. But video games are a poor analogy to the blockbuster standing of movies right now, and movies are having their own kind of reanalysis of what they need to be going forward in the 2020s. So it's an interesting conversation. I wish there were more variety in all sorts of media. Okay, so I think that looks like it's probably about it. If you have any more questions or if you have anything else you want to flag me at Hoeg Law, Super Chats, whatever else you want to do is fine with me, but I will answer things that have a question or anything else that pops up. Otherwise, I really appreciated hanging out with you all. I really appreciated you letting me go through this article with you and hear my thoughts on the video game industry and how it's being reported on in a very tumultuous time, right? And one video I might wind up doing next week is on that tumultuous time for Xbox and Bethesda and some of the other things that I'm seeing kind of loudly discussed in my social media in general. So that might come up next week. Don't know. But thank you so much for being in Hangouts and Headlines today. And I hope to do these more often as we move forward. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Dan, for being here talking about Nicholas Sparks. Really appreciate it. I hope to see you on the Bitcast on Sunday. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.